Hello and welcome to Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we will be discussing the Cleric, and more specifically, how to make it fun to play other than not playing Life Domain Cleric.
Now, it's important to remember in the original, not just D&D, but fantasy games like D&D, Cleric was one of the original four. Fighter, Rogue, Cleric, and Wizard, or those, back in the day, it was sometimes called Mage. Rogue and Wizard still see a lot of play. Those are still highly regarded classes with a lot of interesting variants. But Fighter and Cleric, you still see them play. They're not completely fallen by the wayside by any stretch.
They're not Rangers.
But they have fallen behind a little bit. And in the case of the Cleric, I think the reason why is because Cleric is often outclassed by other things that can do similar things. The most obvious example for the Cleric is the Druid. You can play a Cleric, or you can play a Cleric that can turn into a bear. Like, a Cleric that can turn into a bear is objectively cooler than a Cleric that is just a Cleric.
In fact, in my opinion, the Cleric has a reverse Ranger problem, whereby the Ranger feels very obviously like a hybridization between two classes. The Cleric almost feels like it chose a hybridized class and then extracted the healing aspect out of it without actually making up for the content lost in the process. Great example of this is the Forge Domain Cleric. This actually used to be my favorite type of Cleric. Every time I played it, I'd be playing a Forge Domain. However, there was one issue that happened eventually, which is Eberron came out, and with that, the Artificer easily overcame every single thing that made the Forge Domain in any way unique or useful. And indeed, that is just the sad part about it, is that Forge Domain, it's actually pretty interesting if you think about it. The issue is that if every class has a unique theme or ability that makes it distinct, every single Cleric subclass has a more interesting, specialized other class for it.
Yes, and Clerics, their specialty is healing, but Paladins can heal, Rangers can heal, Bards can heal, and even like some of the newer subclasses of Warlock can heal. I mean, you can even, some of the feats and things like that allow you to take healing spells and abilities that do render the Cleric, again, not useless, but somewhat kind of null and void. So are there any particular classes that come to your mind, Mara, as like, this is a much more interesting, this is a much more playable variant on the Cleric for something unique?
Well, if you're going for a whole class, I'd say that just Celestial Warlock is in every way better than the Cleric as a base, and it provides much more interesting options to explore. But if we're looking at the Cleric itself, Twilight Domain is, in my opinion, the most interesting current Cleric subtype. It's also very strong and very potent, and this is something that the Clerics have lacked for a while, with the exception of Life Domain, which is potent in healing. But Twilight Domain, your party member forgot to get the Dark Vision spell. It's got you covered. You have better dark vision than the Drow, and it sees through magical darkness, and it has a host of other abilities. Honestly, it becomes one of those things where why wouldn't you multi-class and just grab 2 levels of it just to get that ability? And this is in contrast to something which I hated it when I saw it with the Paladin, and that's an entire class dedicated to it, and I hate that it's seeping into other things, which is the Cleric Domain of Hope, which is in Tasha's Cauldron, which is effectively just the forgiveness, or whatever it's called, Paladin. It's like no war and whatever, which is so conducive to D&D, the game where famously we all held hands and sang Kumbaya with the dragons and Lich Kings.
Yes, I mean, I guess the Peace Domain stuff is great for if you're doing a horny bard party where you're trying to sex everything you encounter rather than murder it, but that's a very specific kind of campaign. So yeah, no. I do agree, Twilight Domain's Clerics, the one criticism one might have for that class is that its abilities are a little bit all over the place. It does have some combat-specific abilities, but I am actually a little bit fond of that in a magic user, because when you get to that point where you're out of spell slots and people are down and it's, oh my god, what am I going to do? It is nice if your caster can just pull out their mace or their hammer or whatever it is and start going to town.
Yes, and something else that came to mind with the Twilight Domain is just the aesthetic is very appealing there. And this is something that the Cleric does fundamentally lack. Again, Paladin has, as much as I don't like the class, it has an aesthetic, which is very appealing. That's part of the reason why Rangers don't work, is because they just stole the Druid aesthetic. Necromancers are very distinctive. Like, you could go on and on with every other class. It's part of the reason why Fighters also aren't interesting, is because they're basically just toned down barbarians in most ways. Whereas with the Twilight Domain, it looks pretty neat. So just something to keep in mind, and it's, again, part of the reason why I don't like Life Domain as well, is because it is bland, as Gordon Ramsay would say.
Fair enough. Now, I have played a Trickery Domain Cleric, and I gotta say, I loved that. Their Invoke Duplicity ability, which allows them to make a copy of themselves to try to confuse and deceive the enemy. There is a problem with illusion magic in D&D in that people say it's underpowered. I don't think it is. I think what it is a lot of times DMs underpower it. They don't, like, if you see a whole nother person appear, you're going to have some kind of reaction. At the very least, you're going to, if you're in a fight, you're at the very least going to make your attack at the newcomer or try to get away from the newcomer. It's going to change the map. The NPC, unless they just are immune to illusion magic or something, they're not going to just completely ignore it and go on as if nothing had just happened. Because you got to remember, if something just randomly appears, there's the question of, is this thing real? Assuming the NPC knows that you live in a world where illusion magic is a thing, but also, is this the only one they can make? The NPC may not. I mean, the NPC presumably doesn't have your class and spell list. They don't know, like, are you able to keep summoning more of yourself to keep fighting them? Because that's terrifying. It's one of the reasons why I think Minor Illusion is an underappreciated spell, is because just, you're in a fight, hey, here's this goblin standing right by you with a knife, like, ready to stab. Like, you're going to do something in response. And Trickery Domain does get the Minor Illusion spell, as well as some other great abilities. In addition, the War Domain, now, some people are certainly going to jump on that and say, well, War Domain, when you get to the higher levels, the abilities kind of suck. They're not really that interesting. Here's the thing, though. Level 1, the War Domain Cleric has the ability that as a bonus action, when you take the attack action, as a bonus action, you can make another attack. Which means, if your Wisdom score is 14, which is very low for a Cleric, it should be at least 16, but let's say your Wisdom score is 14, that means you're attacking 3 times. You get 3 extra attacks between long rests, because the ability recharges on a long rest. That's more than a fighter gets. That's more than a barbarian gets. Fighters don't get their action surge until level 2.
Yes, and that also means that if you power that up, which is certainly possible thanks to feats and ability score improvements, or even just natural race improvements if you're min-maxing, then you can get that up to 6 extra attacks, if I'm doing that math right. So that's,
well, if you go to 5, if you go to 20 wisdom, that's 5 extra attacks.
Oh, okay. I thought there was a base 1 that was added no matter what. So
you get 1. So even if your wisdom score is 10, you still get 1. It's a minimum of 1.
Okay.
So a little bit of rules clarification there, which is important. You don't want to go into this thinking you can do something you can't or whatever. But you make a good point, Mara, which is that, as your wisdom score increases, you can use that ability more. And at early levels, that can make all the difference to the party, because you got to remember, a level 1 cleric has, a whopping 2 spell slots? You're going to go through those pretty fast in combat, and you may need to get on the front line. Your fighter, your barbarian, or whoever may be down. I mean, for your ranger, we already filled in his 3 failed death saves because it's a ranger. Now, and in addition to that, their Channel Divinity ability at level 2 allows them to do plus 10 to their attack roll, which is more or less a guaranteed hit. And at higher levels, they can give that to another party member. So when you're moving to that level where the cleric becomes more of a support character, it kind of flows with it a bit. So granted, a level 17 War Domain cleric isn't as powerful as perhaps a level 17, Tempest Domain. But for the majority of the campaign, and for as far as most campaigns realistically get, they are actually quite a boon to the party.
Yes, and my sort of final thought is that especially, I think it was Xanathars that popularized this, and every book since has just continued to expand upon this, but for example, Sorcerer gets aesthetic choices in Xanathar's guide, which allows you to add a few extra quirks and such, With cleric, you don't really get that. I think it's implied that it's supposed to be in your pantheon, but no player or DM really has the time to develop a god, and if they do, they really shouldn't be playing. They should be the DM. And that's part of the issue, is that part of the reason why D&D is so appealing is because there's something magical about every class, whether you like to admit it or not. There has to be something magical about even the barbarian that makes him potent in a world where magic does exist. And to use a bit of a Game of Thrones reference here, is part of the reason why Jaime Lannister felt out of place in the final seasons when dragon queens and things like that were popular. It's just, oh yes, one-handed guy with sword, so appealing. And I'm getting that with cleric, which is disappointing because it could be the most magical class in my opinion.
So my first character was a life domain cleric, and I absolutely tailored his behavior to what his god would appreciate and really tried to go all in with sort of making it work with the god. And you're absolutely right, because I became the forever DM pretty much within my first year of playing D&D.
And my bet would be that you'd never gotten inspiration for role-playing based on your god.
Not that I recall, no.
Mm-hmm.
And with the fighter, one of the things I always stress when I'm talking up characters to my players is I'll say that, an adventurer is something really special, because even a base fighter is somebody who can pick up any weapon they find and know how to use it. Most martial arts masters can't do that. Most martial arts masters, if they've mastered all of the weapons of the Far East, still, if they picked up a European broadsword, they would know how to swing it at somebody, but they wouldn't have mastery of it the way they do. A level 1 fighter could pick up any weapon from anywhere and just know how to use it. That's really special, and we never really see that played out. It's very hard to play it out. Similarly, a cleric is somebody who has a direct line to their god. And it's hard to imagine something much more special and powerful than that. So, players and DMs, that is your challenge. Make your clerics live up to that. And yeah, avoid the life domain because it's boring. Avoid the forage domain because while some of its abilities are awesome, remember, at level 17 you get immunity, not resistance, immunity to fire, which makes it one of the few playable characters that can freely travel on the plane of fire without help.
And avoid hope domain.
What are your thoughts, Internet? What do you think makes a great cleric? What are some fun clerics? What are we wrong about? What do you disagree about? Let's have a little bit of a discussion about this stuff. We're not the final authority on everything. As always, we thank you for watching, and our next episode is going to be about necromancers. Can they be anything other than a cookie-cutter bad guy? We'll see you on that one.